My mother threw an apron at me so I wouldn't ruin the feng shui of their $1 million signing, while my father adjusted the silk tie of my fraudster brother. They see a failure working for pennies, but they don't realize this building and the partner chair he craves have belonged to me for 48 hours. Today is not his coronation. It is simply the day I take out the trash. My name is Valerie Norcross, 32 years old, and in the eyes of the people currently sipping vintage champagne in my parents' living room, I am nothing more than a stain on the upholstery. The Norcross Manor in Connecticut has always been a stage, a sprawling colonial revival set piece designed to project old money and stability. Even when the foundation is quietly rotting away, today, the air conditioning is humming too loudly, struggling to combat the humid July afternoon, while the room smells of lemon polish, expensive perfume, and the distinct metallic scent of desperation. My mother, Beatrice, intercepted me before I could even cross the foyer. She did not hug me. She did not ask how my drive was. Instead, she thrust a silver tray into my hands, her manicured fingers digging into my arm with the strength of a woman terrified of losing her social standing. "You are late, Valerie," she hissed, her voice a low, weaponized whisper. "Preston needs everything to be perfect. Do not mingle. Do not try to network with your little online data entry job. Just make sure the glasses are full and stay out of the photographs. We cannot have you ruining the aesthetic." I adjusted the tray, feeling the cold condensation of the crystal flutes against my skin. I did not argue. Arguments imply that I care about their opinion, or that I am seeking a seat at their table. I am not here to join them. I am here to watch them burn. I moved through the crowd like a ghost. My father, Stanford Norcross, was holding court near the fireplace, his face flushed with scotch and pride. He had his arm around Preston's shoulders, squeezing him as if he could physically transfer his own fading relevance into his son. Preston, at 35, looked every inch the corporate shark he pretended to be. He wore a bespoke navy suit that cost more than my first car. His teeth bleached to a blinding white, his hair coiffed into rigid perfection. "It is in the blood." Stanford boomed to a captive audience of local dignitaries and skeptical neighbors. Preston has always had the vision. Vanguard Holdings approached him. You know, they do not just take anyone as a strategic partner. They need a Norcross to steer the ship. Preston swirled his drink, feigning humility but failing miserably. The arrogance radiated off him in waves. "They focus on distressed assets," Preston explained, his voice smooth, practiced. "Real estate that the market has given up on. It takes a certain kind of eye to see value where others see ruin. I will be spearheading their Connecticut expansion." I paused near the curtains, my face impassive. Vanguard Holdings. To the rest of the room, it was a mysterious, aggressive new player from New York, a venture capital firm that had appeared out of the fog of Wall Street with deep pockets and a ruthless appetite for acquisition. Preston thought he had been headhunted. He believed his reputation as a visionary entrepreneur had finally caught up with him. The reality was far more pathetic. Preston was drowning. I knew the contents of his financial portfolio better than he did. His online gambling debts were astronomical. His last 3 tech startups had evaporated before launch, and he was currently leveraging credit cards to pay off other credit cards. He was not a visionary. He was a mark, and Vanguard Holdings was not looking for a partner. They were looking for a carcass to pick clean. I made the mistake of stepping too close to his circle. Preston's eyes flicked toward me, and the mask of the charming businessman slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the bully beneath. He sneered, gesturing toward the bay window that overlooked the driveway. "Valerie," Preston called out, drawing the attention of half the room. "I saw that heap you drove up in. A Honda Civic, really, you are bringing down the property value just by parking it on the asphalt." A few guests chuckled nervously. Stanford frowned, not at Preston's cruelty, but at the reminder of my mediocrity. I kept my expression neutral. "It gets me from point A to point B." Preston laughed. A sharp, barking sound. He dug into his pocket and tossed a set of keys through the air. They clattered onto my tray, nearly toppling the champagne. "My Porsche is out back," he said, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. "It has a layer of dust on it. Go give it a wash. Will you? I need it spotless. I am driving into the city later to sign the partnership papers, and I cannot show up looking like a peasant." I looked at the heavy key fob resting among the glasses. A lesser version of me, the version from 5 years ago, might have thrown the drink in his face, but anger is inefficient, anger is messy. I simply nodded, picked up the keys, and placed them in my pocket. I checked my watch. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. My phone vibrated against my hip. It was a secure line, a burner device I kept hidden in the deep pocket of my unglamorous dress. I stepped into the shadow of the hallway to check the screen. A single message glowed in the dim light. "The fish has taken the bait. Dossier complete." A cold satisfaction settled in my chest. The trap was not just set. The jaws were already closing. I returned to the living room just in time to hear my father drop the bombshell that sealed his own fate. He was leaning in close to a banker from the club. His voice lowered but still audible to me. "You have to spend money to make money, Bob." Stanford whispered conspiratorially. "I liquidated the retirement accounts, all of it, and we took a second mortgage on the manor. It is just for the capital buy-in. Preston says we will triple the investment in 6 months once the Vanguard deal goes public. It is a show of faith." I felt a flicker of pity, but I extinguished it immediately. They had drained their future to bet on a horse with a broken leg. They were handing over their life savings to pay an entry fee for a club that did not exist. Preston raised his glass. Catching my eye across the room, he smirked, lifting the crystal flute in a mocking toast to his own reflection in the mirror behind me. He made a show of turning too quickly, his elbow knocking into the tray I was holding. Red wine splashed across the Persian rug and splattered onto my shoes. The room went silent. "Look what you did." Preston sighed, shaking his head. "Clumsy. Always so clumsy. Valerie, clean that up before it stains. Mom loves that rug." Beatrice gasped, rushing over, not to check on me, but to inspect the wool. "Get a cloth." "Valerie, honestly, can you not do one simple thing right?" I lowered myself to the floor. I took the cloth from my apron and began to dab at the wine, the dark red liquid looking alarmingly like blood on the ornate fabric, from my kneeling position. I looked up. Preston was standing over me, beaming, basking in the adoration of the room, believing he was the king of the world. He thought he was looking at a servant. He had no idea he was looking at his executioner. I scrubbed the stain, watching the red disappear, counting the seconds. "Enjoy the champagne. Brother, it is the last expensive thing you will ever taste." The water running over my hands in the service sink was freezing, but it felt like a mercy compared to the suffocating heat of the living room. As I scrubbed the red wine from the cloth, the scent of industrial soap hit me, sharp and chemical. It was a smell that instantly transported me back a decade. Stripping away the manor's walls and replacing them with the grease-stained interior of a 24-hour diner on the edge of the State University campus. Memory is a dangerous thing for a family like ours, because it refuses to adhere to the script my parents have written, in their version of history. Preston was the scholar, the prodigy who attended the Ivy League to groom his intellect, while I was the drifting daughter who lacked direction. The truth was far more arithmetic. I worked 3 jobs simultaneously: waitressing, tutoring, and stocking shelves at a library just to keep my tuition checks from bouncing at a public university. I slept 4 hours a night. I ate leftovers from the diner plates before tossing them in the dishwasher. Meanwhile, Preston was at Yale, fully funded by the Bank of Stanford and Beatrice. They paid for his tuition, his fraternity dues, and the luxury apartment he insisted was necessary for his studies. And when he was caught paying a physics major to take his final exams, they paid for that too. A donation to the building fund made the expulsion disappear, scrubbing his record as clean as the floor I was currently standing on. They bought his second chance, and his third. I turned off the tap and squeezed the water from the rag. My reflection in the window above the sink looked tired, but my eyes were clear. I had learned early on that fairness is a fairy tale poor people tell themselves to sleep at night. The true breaking point, the moment that calcified my heart into the weapon it is today, happened 5 years ago. I had come to my father with a business plan. It was solid, meticulous, and small. I needed $5,000 to license a software algorithm I had developed for predicting market volatility. I sat in his study, hands folded, presenting the data. My father had barely looked up from his newspaper. He told me that girls simply do not have the head for business. He said he could not throw good money after bad. He told me to find a husband. 3 days later, a trailer pulled into the driveway towing a 28-foot cabin cruiser named the Sea Spirit. It had cost $200,000, my mother explained, with a straight face, that Preston needed it to relieve the stress of being a visionary. He crashed it into a pier 2 weeks later. They laughed it off as a learning experience. I never asked them for a cent again. They look at me now and see a receptionist. They see a woman who drives a Honda Civic and lives in a studio apartment. They have no idea that the algorithm they rejected is currently the backbone of Phoenix Capital. I dried my hands and checked the secure phone again. A notification from my compliance officer popped up. It was a breakdown of Preston's pitch deck for Vanguard. I scrolled through the slides, and a dark amusement curled in my stomach. The entire concept, a platform for tokenizing distressed real estate assets, was stolen. I recognized the intellectual property immediately. It belonged to Jeff Miller, a brilliant but shy developer Preston had roomed with briefly in New York. Preston had likely waited for Jeff to get drunk, copied the files, and claimed them as his own. It was classic Preston. He was a vampire who mistook the blood he sucked for his own vitality. He had chosen Vanguard Holdings for the same reason a hyena targets a limping gazelle. To the outside world, Vanguard looked like new money, a firm with too much cash and not enough oversight, desperate to make a splash in the Connecticut market. Preston thought he could dazzle us with buzzwords, take the partnership capital, and use it to pay off the sharks circling him before anyone realized his business model was a hollow shell. He did not know that Vanguard was a subsidiary of Phoenix Capital. He did not know that I was the majority shareholder. He did not know that I had created Vanguard specifically to catch him. I walked back toward the party, stopping in the hallway to adjust my dress. The portrait of our family hung on the wall, painted when I was 18. In the painting, I am wearing a long pearl necklace. It was the same necklace my mother accused me of stealing on Christmas Eve that same year. Preston had taken it, pawned it to pay a drug dealer, and then planted the empty velvet box in my backpack. I was kicked out into the snow without a coat. I spent Christmas morning in a shelter, shivering and wondering why they hated me. That night in the shelter, I realized that I was the scapegoat. I was the vessel into which they poured all their failures so that Preston could remain the golden child. If Preston failed, it was the world's fault. If I failed, it was my nature. But the ledger was about to balance. I looked across the room at my parents. Stanford was laughing too loudly at a joke that was not funny. Beatrice was nervously checking her reflection in a spoon. To the guests, they looked like the epitome of landed gentry. But I had seen their credit reports. I knew the truth that they were hiding even from each other. They were hemorrhaging cash. They had refinanced the manor 3 times. The retirement accounts were empty. Every suit, every bottle of wine, every investment in Preston's career was bought on credit. They were digging a hole to the center of the earth. Convinced that if they just kept digging, they would eventually hit gold. Preston was not a businessman. He was a parasite. And my parents were not victims. They were willing hosts. They had fed him their security, their integrity, and their daughter's future. I watched Preston charm a young waitress, his smile oily and practiced. He looked so confident. He thought he was about to secure a partnership that would solve all his problems. He thought the $250,000 buy-in was just a formality, a quick flash of cash to prove liquidity before the real money started rolling in. This was not revenge. Revenge is emotional. Revenge is hot and reactive. This was something colder. This was a medical procedure. I was about to perform a surgical excision of a malignant tumor that had been growing in my life for 3 decades. I would cut them out, not with a knife, but with a fountain pen and a wire transfer. My phone buzzed one last time. It was a text from Elias, my proxy, the man playing the role of the Vanguard CEO. "We are 10 minutes out. Is the room ready?" I looked at the clock. Then I looked at Preston, who was checking his hair in the hallway mirror. I typed back a single word: execute. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and walked into the room to clear the empty glasses. It was time to welcome the new partner. The Vanguard Holdings office was a masterpiece of corporate theater, a stage set I had constructed on the 42nd floor of a gleaming high-rise in Midtown Manhattan. To the untrained eye, it screamed stability and generational wealth. The walls were lined with mahogany paneling that smelled of old libraries, and the abstract art hanging in the foyer was leased from a gallery that catered specifically to firms needing to project instant legitimacy. I had spent $15,000 on the furniture alone, renting heavy leather chairs and a conference table carved from a single slab of walnut. It was an expensive production, but considering the prize was my freedom, it was a bargain. Before my family arrived, I had been testing the surveillance grid from my secure laptop at home. The conference room was equipped with 4 high-definition cameras and microphones, discreetly concealed in the smoke detectors and decorative plants. My lead actor, Elias Thorne, was already in position. Elias was a disbarred attorney I had found working as a compliance officer for a shell company in Delaware. He had the jawline of a senator and the moral compass of a great white shark. I had promised him $50,000 for one afternoon of work, provided he followed my script to the letter. Through the audio feed, his voice had been crisp and commanding, rehearsing the confrontation. But plans change. I had intended to observe my brother's professional undoing from the comfort of my control room, sipping tea while he effectively ruined his own standing. However, my parents, in their infinite need to micromanage their golden child's rise, had insisted on accompanying Preston to the signing. They claimed they were there to provide legal counsel and moral support. In reality, they wanted to bask in the reflection of his glory. And since Preston's actual executive assistant had quit 3 days ago after her paycheck bounced for the second time, I was conscripted. "Valerie, grab the portfolio." My mother had snapped at me in the driveway. "And try to look less like a librarian. You are representing the family, even if you are just holding the door." So, I was no longer the director in the control booth. I was an extra on the stage. I wore a gray wool suit that was 2 seasons out of fashion and scuffed flats, clutching Preston's heavy leather briefcase like a dutiful mule. The elevator ride up was suffocating. Preston was vibrating with a manic energy, checking his reflection in the polished brass doors every 10 seconds. He smelled of nervous sweat and too much cologne. "Remember," Preston told my father, his voice cracking slightly, "the buy-in is just a formality. $250,000 to show skin in the game. Vanguard wires it back with a matching bonus once the due diligence period clears in 48 hours. It is standard procedure for high-level partners. Of course, son." Stanford nodded sagely, adjusting his cufflinks. "It is a leverage play. Shows you have liquid assets. Smart." I stared at the floor numbers ticking upward, fighting the urge to smile. There was no matching bonus. There was no standard procedure. The buy-in requirement was a trap I had designed specifically because I knew Preston did not have the money. I knew exactly how much money Preston had because I had been monitoring his accounts for months. As of this morning, his checking account balance was $1,012.43. He was not just short, he was destitute. But desperation is the mother of felony. The night before, while my parents slept, I had watched Preston's digital activity through a keylogger I had installed on his laptop months ago during a family dinner. I watched as he navigated to a marketplace on the dark web, bypassing security protocols with the clumsy ineptitude of an amateur. He had hired a hacker, a user named Codebreaker99, to purchase a piece of software designed for bank spoofing. It was a simple, elegant, and highly illegal program. It created a visual overlay for his online banking portal, when he logged in. The software would intercept the data from the bank and rewrite the HTML on his screen to display whatever number he typed into the configuration file. He was going to log into his real bank account, but the screen would show a balance of $250,000 instead of $1,000. He intended to show this to the Vanguard partners as proof of funds. I had watched him test it at 3 a.m. I saw the relief wash over his face via his own webcam when the fake numbers appeared on the screen. He thought he had found a loophole. He did not understand that by using a digital device to falsify financial records for the purpose of securing a business contract, he was committing wire fraud and federal identity theft. He was not just lying to his parents. He was handing me the handcuffs. The elevator chimed pleasantly as we reached the 42nd floor. The doors slid open to reveal the Vanguard lobby, a space of intimidating minimalism. A receptionist I had hired from a temp agency sat behind a glass desk, typing furiously on a keyboard that was not connected to anything. "Mr. Norcross," she said, not even looking up. "Mr. Thorne is expecting you in the boardroom." Preston strode forward, chest puffed out, flanked by our parents. I trailed 3 steps behind the invisible servant. As we walked down the corridor, I caught Elias's eye through the glass wall of the conference room. He was standing at the head of the table, reviewing a stack of documents. He saw me, the woman who signed his checks, the woman who owned the building, the woman who held his leash dressed in drab gray, carrying a fraudster's bag. He did not blink. He did not smile. He simply turned his attention to Preston, his expression hardening into professional indifference. "Welcome to Vanguard," Elias said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "I trust you brought the liquidity." Preston set his laptop bag on the table, his hands shaking ever so slightly. "Absolutely," Preston said, flashing a smile that didn't reach his terrified eyes. "Everything is in order." I moved to the corner of the room, near the water cooler, and set the briefcase down. My mother shot me a look of disdain, mouthing the word posture at me. I straightened my back, folded my hands, and waited. The fly had entered the spider's web, and he had brought his parents to watch him be devoured. The heavy oak doors of the conference room swung open, and my family stepped into the trap I had lovingly decorated for them. If the lobby had been impressive, the boardroom was designed to bring men like my father to their knees. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline, a visual testament to power that seemed to validate every delusion of grandeur my parents held. Stanford ran his hand along the back of a leather chair, his eyes wide with a reverence he usually reserved for church. He looked at the polished walnut table as if he wanted to kiss it. "This is it," Stanford whispered to Beatrice, his voice thick with emotion. "This is the big leagues. Bae, our boy has finally arrived." Beatrice nodded, clutching her handbag tightly, her eyes darting around the room to appraise the value of the art on the walls. She looked at me, standing by the door with the briefcase, and her expression instantly soured. "Valerie, do not just stand there like a statue," she hissed, pointing a manicured finger toward the credenza in the corner. "Make coffee, and use the good cups. Do not embarrass us with your slowness." I moved to the corner of the room where a high-end espresso machine sat waiting. It was a complex piece of machinery, chrome and steam, and I took my time measuring the beans. I was not slow because I was incompetent. I was slow because I wanted to be the fly on the wall, the invisible background noise that everyone ignored while the tragedy unfolded. As the machine began to whir, the side door opened. Elias Thorne walked in. He did not walk. He marched. I had coached Elias to channel the energy of a man who makes more money in an hour than most people make in a decade, and he was performing beautifully. He wore a charcoal suit that was cut sharp enough to draw blood, and he carried nothing but a thin file folder. He did not smile. He did not offer his hand to my father, who had already half risen from his chair to greet him. "Sit," Elias said. The command was soft, but it carried the weight of a gavel. Stanford sank back into his chair, looking slightly flushed. Preston adjusted his tie, a bead of sweat already forming at his hairline despite the aggressive air conditioning. "Mr. Norcross," Elias said, turning his cold gaze to Preston. We have reviewed your preliminary profile. The board is intrigued by your background. We see potential in your unconventional approach to market disruption. Preston beamed. He puffed out his chest, mistaking the vague pleasantry for genuine admiration. Thank you. Mr. Thorne, I have always believed that the intersection of technology and real estate requires a paradigm shift. I turned the knob on the steam wand, creating a loud hissing noise that made Beatrice jump. She shot me a look of pure venom. I ignored her, focusing on the foam. Elias ignored the interruption. However, at Vanguard, potential is a commodity we trade in bulk. What we value is solvency. We are closing our books for the quarter in exactly 15 minutes. If you want to be part of this funding round, we need to conclude the due diligence now. Preston nodded eagerly. Of course, due diligence is the cornerstone of any synergistic partnership. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Preston was using words he had heard on television, stringing them together in a sentence that meant absolutely nothing. Synergistic partnership. He sounded like a broken AI bot. I would like to present my vision for the Connecticut corridor. Preston continued, standing up and gesturing grandly with his hands. I plan to leverage blockchain methodologies to tokenize the distress signals of the suburban market. We will utilize a top-down funnel approach to maximize the ROI on these assets. I poured the coffee into the china cups. Tokenize the distress signals. It was gibberish. He was talking about turning foreclosure notices into cryptocurrency, which was not only impossible but also illegal in the way he was describing it. Elias let him ramble for another 30 seconds, watching him with the bored expression of a predator watching a mouse run on a wheel. Then, he raised one hand. Stop, Elias said. Preston froze mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open. We do not need the pitch, Elias said, checking his watch. We have already analyzed the market. We know the play. What we need to see is the skin in the game. As discussed in our correspondence, the buy-in for a junior partner is $250,000. This capital is held in escrow to cover the initial risk assessment. Preston sat down slowly. Yes, the capital. Elias leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table. Show me. This was the moment. I placed a cup of coffee in front of my father, then my mother. They did not thank me. They were too focused on Preston. Stanford was looking at his son with an encouraging nod, silently urging him to show the man the money. Preston opened his laptop. His fingers were trembling. I could see the tremor from 5 feet away. He typed in his password and navigated to the spoofed banking interface he had set up the night before. I moved behind him, ostensibly to place a glass of water on the table, but really to get a clear view of the screen. There it was, the National Bank logo, and in the center of the screen, in bold black numbers, $250,000. It was a beautiful forgery. The font was correct. The layout was perfect. To anyone looking at the screen, it appeared that Preston Norcross was flush with cash. Preston turned the laptop around to face Elias. A confident smile plastered itself back onto his face. As you can see, Preston said, his voice regaining some of its swagger, the funds are secured. $250,000, sitting in my primary checking account, ready for deployment. Stanford let out a breath he had been holding. See? He whispered to Beatrice. I told you. He has it handled. Elias looked at the screen. He studied the numbers. Then he looked up at Preston. And for the first time, he smiled. It was a shark's smile. Impressive, Elias said. It is rare to see that kind of liquidity in a personal account these days. Most people tie it up in assets. I like to keep my powder dry, Preston said, leaning back in his chair, ready to strike when the iron is hot. Excellent, Elias said. He closed the file folder in front of him. Then, we can proceed. Preston reached for the contract lying on the table. Great. Where do I sign, not the signature? Elias said smoothly. The wire. Preston's hand froze inches from the pen. Excuse me. Since the 1st of the month, new federal regulations regarding anti-money laundering have come into effect for all venture capital firms operating in New York. Elias lied. It was a beautiful lie, grounded just enough in reality to be terrifying. We can no longer accept a screenshot or a promise of payment as proof of funds. We need to see the transaction clear our escrow account in real time. The room went dead silent. The hum of the air conditioner suddenly seemed deafening. Elias pointed to the laptop. "You are already logged in. That is perfect. Go to the transfer tab. I will give you our routing number. You will initiate the wire transfer of $250,000 right now, while we watch. Once I see the confirmation code on your screen, you are a partner." Preston's face drained of color so fast it looked like the blood had simply evaporated from his body. He stared at Elias, his eyes wide and glassy. Right now," Preston stammered. "Right now," Elias said. "We have 12 minutes before the books close." I watched Preston's throat work as he swallowed. He could not do it. The software he was using was a mask. It was a cosmetic overlay. If he tried to actually transfer $250,000, the bank's real system would reject it because he only had $1,000. The error message would pop up instantly, "Insufficient funds." And if that message popped up on the big screen, the game would be over. The lie would be exposed. Preston looked at his laptop as if it were a bomb. He looked at Stanford. He looked at Beatrice. Then he looked at me. And for a second, I saw pure, unadulterated panic. "Is there a problem?" "Mr. Norcross?" Elias asked, his voice dropping an octave. No, Preston squeaked. "No problem. It is just—" He was trapped. He was sitting at a table with a shark, his parents, and a lie that was about to eat him alive. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, broken only by the hum of the hard drive in Preston's laptop and the terrified rhythm of his breathing. His finger hovered over the enter key, trembling like a leaf in a gale. He stared at the screen, at the beautiful, fraudulent lie he had constructed, and he knew that if he clicked that button, the illusion would shatter. The banking software would attempt to communicate with the server. The server would query his account, and it would find a balance of barely 4 figures. The error message would not just deny the transfer, it would flag the account for suspicious activity. Preston pulled his hand back as if the keyboard were red-hot iron. He patted his jacket pockets, his movements jerky and exaggerated, a pantomime of a man looking for something he knew he did not have. "My security token," Preston stammered, his eyes darting to Elias. "The hardware key. I must have left it on the dresser at the manor. I cannot authorize a wire of this magnitude without the physical RSA token. It is a security protocol." He looked at his watch, feigning frustration. "I can drive back and get it. Or better yet, I can send you a screenshot of the confirmation in 30 minutes. My mother can call the house and have the maid read the code." Elias did not blink. He did not look at the parents. He looked only at the clock on the wall. Then back to Preston. "We do not accept screenshots, Mr. Norcross, and we do not wait." Elias leaned forward, his voice dropping to a register that suggested he was sharing a confidential and unpleasant truth. "There is a representative from a competing firm sitting in our lobby right now. They have the capital ready. They have the paperwork signed. I gave you priority because I liked your profile, but my fiduciary duty is to the fund. If the money is not in escrow in 10 minutes, I am legally obligated to walk out that door and sign the deal with them." 10 minutes, Preston whispered. The color had left his face entirely. He spun his chair around to face our father. Stanford looked confused, his brow furrowed. "Son, what is going on?" Stanford asked. "Just transfer the money. You showed us the balance. The bank is undergoing scheduled maintenance on the wire servers." Preston lied, his voice a frantic hiss. "I saw the notification earlier, but I thought I could bypass it. If I try to force it through now without the token, it might lock the account for 48 hours. I have the money. Dad, you know I have the money. It is just a technical glitch." He was drowning. He was flailing in the water, dragging everyone near him down into the abyss. I stood in the corner, holding the silver coffee pot, watching the panic set in. It was time to throw him the rope that was actually a noose. I cleared my throat. It was a soft, hesitant sound, designed to be ignored until it was necessary. "Excuse me, Preston," I said, pitching my voice to sound helpful and slightly dim-witted. They all turned to look at me. Beatrice looked annoyed that the furniture was speaking. "What is it?" Beatrice snapped. I clutched the coffee pot tighter. I remember reading the attachment in the email. Mr. Thorne sent last week. Didn't it say something about a secured asset clause? For temporary holds. Preston's eyes went wide. He looked at me, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look at me with contempt. He looked at me like I was a lifeboat. "Yes," Preston shouted. Spinning back to Elias. "The collateral clause. I can pledge an asset to secure the position, just until tomorrow morning when the bank clears the transfer." Elias paused. He tapped his pen against the table. Pretending to consider it. "We do allow for asset-backed security holds," Elias said slowly. "However, given the volatility of the market, we require a 2-to-1 ratio to cover the risk. If the buy-in is $250,000, we would need unencumbered real estate with a verified market value of at least $500,000. Preston froze. He owned nothing. He leased his car. He rented his apartment. He didn't even own the watch on his wrist. It was a loaner from a friend he was avoiding. He turned back to our parents. His eyes were wet. He looked like a child who had broken a vase and needed them to hide the pieces. "Dad," Preston pleaded, "it is just for 24 hours. Just until I can get the token and clear the wire. The money is there. You saw it." Stanford Norcross sat up straighter. He looked at the frantic desperation in his son's eyes, and then he looked at Elias, who was already starting to gather his papers as if to leave. The pride that had sustained my father for 60 years, the arrogance that made him believe his bloodline was destined for greatness, kicked in. He could not let this stranger walk away. He could not let the BlackRock representative in the lobby take his son's victory. Stanford reached into his inner suit pocket. He pulled out a thick envelope. He had brought the family's financial portfolio to show off, to prove that the Norcross name was backed by tangible wealth. "Stanford." "Are you sure?" Beatrice whispered, her hand trembling as she reached for his arm. "That is the house. It is just for a day." Stanford snapped, his voice tight. "Do you want him to fail? Do you want him to be a laughingstock? He has the money. It is just a technicality." Stanford pulled out the deed to the Norcross Manor. It was the only thing they had left. The retirement funds were gone. The stocks were liquidated. This house, the symbol of their status, was the final chip on the table. He slid the document across the polished walnut table. "The manor is appraised at $1.2 million, Stanford said, his voice trying to sound authoritative but cracking at the edges. "That should be more than sufficient." Elias picked up the deed. He examined it with the dispassionate eye of a butcher inspecting a cut of meat. "It appears to be in order," Elias said. He opened his briefcase and produced a single sheet of paper. It was a deed in lieu of foreclosure agreement. It was a brutal, airtight contract. It stated that the title of the property was being transferred to Vanguard Holdings as a security deposit. If the cash sum of $250,000 was not received by wire transfer within 24 hours, the transfer of the property would become permanent and irrevocable. "Standard boilerplate," Elias said, sliding the contract toward my parents. "Sign here, and here. This holds the partnership slot for Preston until noon tomorrow." I watched from the corner. My heart was hammering against my ribs, not from fear, but from a terrifying exhilaration. I was watching them sign their own death warrant. They believed so completely in the lie of their own superiority that they could not see the cliff edge. Stanford uncapped his fountain pen. He looked at Preston one last time. "You fix this first thing in the morning," Stanford said sternly. "I promise." "Dad," Preston said, relief flooding his face. "First thing," Stanford signed. Then Beatrice signed, her signature shaky and small. Elias took the paper. He checked the signatures. He placed it in his folder. Done. Elias said, "I looked at the clock. The trap was sprung. The cage door had slammed shut, and they were still smiling, thinking they had just bought a ticket to paradise. They had no idea they had just become homeless." The ink on the deed to the manor was barely dry when Elias tightened the noose one final notch. He did not put the pen away. Instead, he tapped the screen of his tablet, his brow furrowing slightly as if checking a minor administrative detail. "The legal department is pinging me," Elias said, his voice casual but firm. "Since the wire is being delayed until tomorrow, they need a digital placeholder for the compliance file, a proof of intent." Preston looked up, sweat beading on his upper lip. "A proof of what? A transaction receipt," Elias clarified. "You said you had the transfer queued up. Even if you cannot execute it without the token, your banking portal should allow you to generate a pending transfer request document, just a PDF showing the amount and the destination account. Upload that to me, and we are done." It was a lie. Of course, no bank generates a formal receipt for a transfer that has not been authorized. But Preston did not know that, or rather, he was too terrified to question it. He was operating on the logic of a drowning man if he could just keep his head above water for one more minute. The rescue boat would arrive. He nodded vigorously, turning back to his laptop. "Right," Preston said. "The pending receipt. I can download that." I moved slightly to the left, angling myself so I could see the reflection of his screen in the glass of the window behind him. He was not logging into the bank. He was opening a file folder on his desktop labeled Docs. Inside, he selected a file named generic_wire_template, PSD. He was opening Photoshop. My heart began to race, not with fear, but with the thrill of the hunt. This was the moment of no return. Up until now. Preston had been lying. Lying is a moral failing. Lying to get money is fraud. Yes, but it can be hard to prove in court. But fabricating a financial document, creating a forgery with a federal bank seal, and transmitting it across state lines via the internet. That was a specific, codified felony. That was 18 U.S. Code Section 1343. That was wire fraud. I watched as his fingers flew across the trackpad. He was clumsy but fast. He pasted the Vanguard routing number into the destination field. He typed in the amount, $250,000. He adjusted the date to today. Then, with a final stroke of idiocy, he dragged a low-resolution JPEG of the National Bank seal onto the header to make it look official. He was manufacturing evidence of a crime while sitting 10 feet away from his victims. Preston saved the file as a PDF. He opened his email client. "Sending it now," Preston said, his voice tight, just waiting for the Wi-Fi. He attached the forged document. He typed Elias's email address, and then, with a single click of his index finger, he sealed his fate. Sent. A second later, the phone in my pocket vibrated against my thigh. A single, solid buzz. I slipped my hand into my pocket and unlocked the screen by touch. I did not need to look to know what was there. But I checked anyway. The email had arrived on the private server I hosted in my apartment basement. I opened the attachment. It was the PDF. I tapped the Info tab to view the metadata. It was damning. The metadata history showed the file creation time was less than 30 seconds ago. The creating application was listed clearly, Adobe Photoshop CC. I had him. I had the digital smoking gun, time-stamped and geolocated. He had not just dug his own grave, he had jumped in and pulled the dirt over his head. Elias checked his tablet. He swiped down to refresh his inbox. "Received," Elias said. He opened the file, pretending to scrutinize it. He nodded slowly. "Looks perfect. The seal is there. The routing number matches." Elias stood up and extended his hand across the table. "Congratulations, Mr. Norcross. The compliance team is satisfied. You are officially a partner at Vanguard Holdings." The tension in the room snapped like a rubber band. Stanford let out a loud, shuddering breath and surged to his feet. He grabbed Preston's hand and pulled him into a crushing embrace, slapping his back with enough force to bruise. "I knew it." Stanford roared, his voice cracking with emotion. "I knew you had it in you. Son, a partner at Vanguard." Beatrice was dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. Her earlier anxiety instantly replaced by a smug, preening satisfaction. She looked at the signed deed on the table, the deed to the only home she had ever known, and dismissed it completely. In her mind, it was already retrieved. Her son was a genius. He would fix everything. She turned to me. I was still standing by the coffee machine. The invisible servant in the gray suit. "Do you see this?" Valerie Beatrice said, her voice dripping with condescension. "This is what ambition looks like. This is what happens when you apply yourself instead of wasting your life on whatever it is you do. You should be taking notes from your brother." I said nothing. I just watched them. Preston pulled away from his father, adjusting his suit jacket. The arrogance was back, stronger than ever. The fear that had crippled him 5 minutes ago was gone, replaced by the dopamine rush of having gotten away with it. He looked at Elias, then at his parents, and finally, his gaze landed on me. He sneered. It was a look of pure, unadulterated disdain. "All right, the grown-ups have business to discuss," Preston said, waving his hand at me as if shooing away a fly. "You can go now, Valerie. And honestly, do not bother coming to the celebratory dinner tonight. I do not want you sitting there looking like a charity case and embarrassing me in front of my new colleagues." He turned his back on me. "Go wash the car again. Make yourself useful." Something inside me shifted. It was not a snap. It was a click. The final tumbler of the lock falling into place. I had the deed. I had the wire fraud evidence. I had the confession of debt. I had everything. I picked up the heavy crystal water pitcher from the side table. It was full of ice and water. I walked over to the main conference table. I did not pour it. I did not throw it. I lifted it 6 inches off the table and slammed it down. Clack! The sound was like a gunshot in the confined space. The heavy glass hit the walnut wood with a violence that made the water jump and the ice rattle. The room went instantly silent. Stanford jumped. Beatrice gasped. Preston spun around, his mouth open in shock. "What the hell are you doing?" Preston barked. "Are you crazy?" I said. "Get out." I did not flinch. I did not lower my eyes. For the first time in 32 years, I did not shrink. I stood straight, my shoulders back, taking up space in the room that I owned. In the building that I owned, facing the people I owned, I looked Preston dead in the eye. The submissive sister was gone. The receptionist was gone. "I am not going anywhere." "Preston," I said. My voice was calm, steady, and terrifyingly cold. "But you are—" The echo of the heavy glass pitcher hitting the table seemed to hang in the air, vibrating against the mahogany like a tuning fork. The silence that followed was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a vacuum before an explosion. I did not wait for them to recover. I stepped away from the side table, leaving the coffee pot and the servant's roll behind me in the shadows. I walked with a slow, deliberate cadence toward the head of the table, the spot where the sunlight from the floor-to-ceiling windows formed a halo around the leather executive chair. Preston watched me, his face twisting from shock into a rictus of annoyance. He looked at me as if I were a malfunctioning appliance that had suddenly started walking across the room. "What the hell are you doing?" Preston shouted, half rising from his seat. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "Get away from there, Valerie. Have you lost your mind? That is Mr. Thorne's seat. You are going to ruin everything." I ignored him. I ignored the way my mother clutched her pearls, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I ignored my father's reddening face. I kept my eyes fixed on Elias Thorne. As I approached, Elias did not scold me. He did not call security. He did not look at me with the disdain my family expected. Instead, Elias pushed his chair back. He stood up, buttoned his suit jacket with a sharp snap, and stepped aside. He lowered his head in a deep, respectful bow. Not the polite nod of a colleague, but the deferential bow of a lieutenant addressing his commander. "Madam Chairwoman," Elias said, his voice clear and projecting to the back of the room. "The acquisition documents are filed. The deed is secured. All legal procedures have been executed according to your instructions." The room went so quiet, I could hear the hum of the server rack in the closet down the hall. Preston froze. He looked at Elias, then at me, then back at Elias. He let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. "What?" Preston asked, his voice trembling. "What did you call her? Is this a joke?" Because if this is some kind of hazing ritual for new partners, it is not funny. Elias did not answer. He simply gestured to the empty chair. I sat down. The leather was cool against my back. I placed my hands on the armrests. Feeling the texture of the grain, it felt right. It felt like armor. I swiveled the chair slowly, turning away from the window and the view of the city I had conquered, to face the three people who had spent my entire life convincing me I was worthless. I interlaced my fingers on the table, leaning forward just enough to make them uncomfortable. You asked me a question earlier. Preston, I said softly. You asked who I told to get out. I waited a beat, letting the question sink in. I was talking to you, brother. Preston blinked, his brain misfiring as it tried to process the impossible data in front of him. He looked at Stanford for help, but our father was staring at Elias with a look of dawning horror. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen and swiped up to cast the display to the massive 80-inch monitor mounted on the wall behind me. The screen flickered to life. The generic Vanguard Holdings screensaver vanished, replaced by a stark black and white logo, a stylized phoenix rising from a bed of ashes. Phoenix Capital. Below the logo was an organizational chart. It was a simple tree diagram, but the lines were thick and unmistakable. At the top was Phoenix Capital. Branching down from it were a dozen subsidiaries, shell companies, real estate holding firms, and debt acquisition vehicles. And right in the center, glowing in bright white light, was Vanguard Holdings. But it was the text on the right side of the screen that sucked the air out of the room. Owner and majority shareholder Valerie Norcross. Chief Executive Officer Valerie Norcross. My mother let out a sound that was half gasp, half whimper. She slumped back in her chair, her hand flying to her chest. No, Beatrice stammered, shaking her head violently. That is impossible. That is a mistake. You are a receptionist. You enter data. You drive a Civic. You do not own companies. You do not own anything, I smiled. It was not a nice smile. I do enter data. Mother, I said, I enter the data that decides which companies live and which ones die on Wall Street. I have been doing it for 5 years. While you were busy criticizing my shoes and telling me I had no head for business, I was building a portfolio that dwarfs this entire building. I reached for the thick manila folder that Elias had left on the table. I picked it up and tossed it. It slid across the polished walnut surface, spinning slightly before coming to a stop directly in front of my father. Open it, I commanded. Stanford stared at the folder as if it contained anthrax. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely lift the cover. He flipped it open, and his eyes scanned the first page, then the second, then the third. With every page, his face lost more color, turning from a flush of anger to a pale, sickly gray. What is this? Stanford whispered. I leaned back, crossing my legs. That is the ledger of your life. Dad, I said. I pointed to the first document. 3 years ago, Preston started a tech incubator called TechStart. He burned through $400,000 of investor money in 6 months on parties and leased sports cars. When it collapsed, the debt was sold to a collection agency. Preston flinched. How do you know that? Because I bought the debt. Preston, I said, I bought it for pennies on the dollar because the agency knew you were insolvent. I have been holding that note for 3 years, letting the interest compound. You owe me $600,000. I pointed to the next document in Stanford's hands. And you, Dad, the bank you used to refinance the manor, the one you begged for a second mortgage so you could fund Preston's gambling addiction disguised as capital. I acquired a controlling stake in that regional branch 6 months ago. I sit on the board that approved your loan, and I am the one who flagged it for immediate recall if the collateral was ever leveraged elsewhere. Stanford dropped the folder, the papers scattered across the table, and finally, I continued, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. The document you just signed, the deed in lieu, you thought you were giving it to a stranger named Elias Thorne. You thought you were giving it to Vanguard Holdings. I tapped the table with my index finger. Vanguard is me. Phoenix is me. Elias works for me. I stood up again, leaning over the table, looming over them. Congratulations, Mom and Dad. You just signed the family home over to your daughter. I am the new owner of 42 Oak Lane, and unlike you, I do not tolerate late payments. The silence that followed was total. It was the silence of a worldview shattering. My parents looked at me, really looked at me. For the first time in their lives, they did not see the disappointment. They did not see the scapegoat. They saw a stranger with their daughter's face, a stranger who held their lives in the palm of her hand and was slowly closing her fist. Stanford's face turned a violent shade of purple. The shock was wearing off, replaced by the defensive rage of a patriarch who had lost control. He slammed his fist onto the table. "You ungrateful little witch," Stanford roared. "You deceived us. You deceived your own parents. You set us up." He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "We raised you, we fed you, and this is how you repay us, by tricking us out of our home, by humiliating your brother. This is unconscionable. It is immoral." I laughed. It was a dry, sharp sound. "Immoral?" I asked. I walked around the table until I was standing right in front of him. I was wearing heels. But even without them, I felt 10 feet tall. "You taught me this, Dad," I said, cold and flat. "Do you remember what you told me when I asked for $5,000 to start my business? You told me that the market does not care about feelings. You told me that sentimental value is a liability. You told me that emotion is a barrier to business." I gestured to the room, to the view, to the deed lying on the table. "I took your advice. I removed the emotion. I treated this family exactly like what it is, a failing corporation with bad management and toxic assets. I did a hostile takeover." I looked at Beatrice, who was weeping silently into her hands. "You wanted a successful child," I said. "You wanted a shark. Well, look at me. Mother, you got one." I turned back to Preston. He was slumped in his chair, looking small and broken. The swagger was gone. The fake partner was gone. All that was left was a frightened boy in a suit he couldn't afford. "This is not betrayal, Dad," I said, picking up the deed and sliding it into my own briefcase. "This is just investing, and I just closed the deal of a lifetime." "You set me up," Preston screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine that sounded nothing like the confident executive he had pretended to be 5 minutes ago. He slammed his hands on the table, knocking over the empty water glass. "This is entrapment. You hacked my computer. I will sue you. I will sue this entire fake company for every dime you have." I did not flinch. I did not even blink. I simply tapped a key on my laptop, and the image on the giant wall monitor shifted. The organizational chart of Phoenix Capital vanished, replaced by the PDF document Preston had just emailed to Elias. It was the fake wire transfer receipt. It looked impressive on the big screen, with the bank logo pixelated slightly from being dragged and dropped. "Entrapment implies I forced you to commit a crime." "Preston," I said, my voice level and calm, cutting through his hysteria like a scalpel. "All I did was ask for a receipt. You chose to manufacture one." I zoomed in on the document. I highlighted the File Properties tab on the right side of the screen. "Look at the screen." "Dad," I said, "read the metadata." Stanford squinted at the glowing text. He was still trembling, his face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. "Author Preston Norcross." I read aloud. "Creation date today, at 2:35 post-meridian. Application Adobe Photoshop, Creative Cloud." I turned to face my brother. "Banks do not generate wire confirmations using Photoshop. Preston, they generate them from secure servers. This is a forgery. And because you sent it over the internet to a corporate server to secure a financial benefit, it is not just a lie. It is a felony." I stood up and walked toward the window, outlining the skyline with my hand. "It is called wire fraud, under Title 18, United States Code, Section 1343, and since you also forged the seal of a federally insured financial institution, we can add bank fraud to the indictment. The sentencing guidelines for this amount of money. You are looking at 20 to 30 years in federal prison." Preston sank back into his chair. He looked like he had been punched in the gut. The fight went out of him instantly, replaced by a terrified, infantile whimpering. But that is not the only thing I have to show you. I continued. I swiped the screen again. This time, a bank statement appeared. But it was not the fake one Preston had shown us. It was his actual statement from the National Bank, retrieved by my forensic accountants earlier that morning. The balance was highlighted in red, $412.18. Preston, I said, pointing to the number, this is what you actually have. I swiped again. A credit card statement appeared. And this is what you owe. American Express, Visa, MasterCard, a total of $82,450 in unsecured debt. You are not a partner. You are destitute. My mother let out a sharp cry, pressing her hands over her mouth. She looked at the screen, then at Preston, shaking her head in denial. No, Beatrice whispered. No, he told us the startups were just liquidity constrained. He said the money was tied up in equity. There is no equity. Mother, I said brutally, there never was. I pulled up a spreadsheet. It was a categorized list of Preston's expenditures over the last 3 years, the 3 years during which my parents had drained their retirement accounts to fund his ventures. I pointed to the rows of data. Here is the $50,000 you gave him for the server farm investment in 2023. I said, he spent it on a 2-week trip to Las Vegas and a suite at the Bellagio. I pointed to another row. Here is the $30,000 for the patent filing fees last year. It went to an online sports betting site based in the Caribbean. He lost it all in 48 hours betting on greyhound races. I turned to my father. Stanford was slumped in his chair, staring at the table. He looked 20 years older than he had when he walked into the room. He was a broken man, realizing that the altar he had worshipped at for decades was made of papier-mâché. He is not a genius. Dad, I said, he never was. You projected your own dreams onto him, and he used them to bleed you dry. I leaned in close, delivering the verdict. He is a parasite, and you and Mom. You are the hosts. You let him feed on you until there was nothing left. Preston slid out of his chair. He did not stand up. He fell to his knees. He crawled toward Stanford, grabbing the hem of his father's jacket. Tears were streaming down his face, ruining his expensive spray tan. Dad, please, Preston sobbed. It was just a bad run. I can fix it. I just need more time. Do not let her do this. Do not let her send me to jail. I am your son. Stanford looked down at him. For the first time in his life, he did not see the golden child. He saw a pathetic, weeping thief who had cost him his legacy. Stanford pulled his jacket away from Preston's grip with a look of pure revulsion. I have nothing left to give you, Stanford rasped, his voice hollow. I signed the house away. I have nothing. Preston turned to Beatrice. Mom, please talk to her. Beatrice looked at me. Her eyes were wide and desperate. She reached out a hand across the table, palm up, pleading. Valerie, she said, her voice trembling, think about what you are doing. This is your brother. We are your family. You cannot send your own brother to prison. You cannot take our home. We are blood. I looked at her hand. I looked at the diamond ring she wore, a ring she had kept while I was eating ramen noodles in a cold apartment. Family, I repeated the word, tasting the bitterness of it. I walked back to the head of the table and leaned against the leather chair. Do you remember last November? Mother Beatrice blinked, confused by the shift in topic. What last November? I said, I was hospitalized for 3 days. I collapsed at my desk from exhaustion because I was closing the acquisition of a logistics firm in Chicago. My kidneys were failing from dehydration and stress. I stared at her, forcing her to meet my gaze. I called you. I called you from the emergency room. I told you I was scared. I told you I was alone. Beatrice swallowed hard. I remember. And do you remember what you said I asked? She looked down. You said you could not come because you had a non-refundable appointment at the Golden Door Spa. You said, and I quote, Take some aspirin and stop being so dramatic. Valerie, the memory was a cold stone in my stomach. But I used it. I used it to kill the last flickering ember of guilt I might have felt. You left me alone in a hospital bed so you could get a mud mask. Mother, I said, you did not care if I lived or died. As long as I did not inconvenience your schedule. I picked up the deed to the house and tapped it against the table. So do not talk to me about family. Family is a luxury you cannot afford anymore. You spent all your emotional capital on him. I pointed at Preston, who was still sobbing on the floor. And now, the account is overdrawn. The sound of my mother's weeping was the only thing filling the room, a pathetic, rhythmic noise that grated against my nerves. I checked my watch. The market would close soon, and I had other businesses to attend to. I did not have the patience for a prolonged family therapy session. Get up, Preston, I said, my voice cutting through the air like a whip crack. He remained on the floor, clutching his knees, a puddle of expensive wool and broken ego. I said, get up, I repeated, louder this time. I am presenting a settlement offer. You can listen, or I can call the federal marshals to drag you out. It makes no difference to me. Preston scrambled to his feet, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. He looked at me with the eyes of a trapped animal, fearful, hating, but listening. Stanford and Beatrice lifted their heads, desperate for any lifeline I might throw them. I walked to the whiteboard wall on the left side of the room. I picked up a black marker and drew a vertical line down the center. You are currently in a deficit position, I began, speaking with the clinical detachment of a bankruptcy trustee. However, I am willing to offer a restructuring plan. You have two options. I wrote a large capital letter A on the left side. Option A is the default legal trajectory, I explained. I forward the PDF of the forged wire receipt, along with the IP logs and metadata, to the FBI Cybercrimes Division. I also forward the recording of this meeting to the SEC. I looked at Preston. You will be arrested before you leave the parking garage. Given the amount of money involved and the federal nature of the crime, bail will be set high. Since you have no assets and your parents just signed away their house, you will await trial in Rikers Island. You will likely be sentenced to 20 years. I turned to my parents. Under this option, since the deed transfer was part of a fraudulent transaction initiated by Preston, the contract is voided. But the bank which I control will immediately call in the loan on the manor due to breach of trust covenants. You will be evicted within 30 days. The story of how the great Norcross family fell due to fraud will be front-page news. You will be social pariahs. Beatrice whimpered. The thought of losing her social standing was evidently more terrifying than her son going to prison. I wrote a large capital letter B on the right side of the board. Option B, I said, the quiet liquidation. I capped the marker and turned to face them. In this scenario, I do not file charges. The FBI stays out of it. Preston let out a breath, his shoulders sagging in relief. However, I continued, my voice hardening. There are conditions. First, Preston leaves New York. In fact, he leaves the East Coast entirely. I hear North Dakota is affordable this time of year. You will disappear from our lives. You will sign a document today formally renouncing any future claim to the Norcross estate or inheritance. I looked at my parents. You two can stay in the manor, but you will stay as tenants. You will pay me monthly rent at fair market value. The deed remains in my name. If you miss a payment, if you damage the property, or if you attempt to funnel money to Preston, you will be evicted immediately. And finally, I said, turning back to Preston, the closing cost. I pointed to his phone, which was lying on the table. You will unlock your phone. You will open your LinkedIn, your Instagram, and your Facebook. You will post a status update that I have already drafted for you. It states that you are leaving the industry due to professional misconduct, that you fabricated your past successes, and that you are seeking help for pathological lying. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Preston stared at me, his face twisting in horror. He shook his head slowly, then violently. No, Preston whispered. No, I cannot do that. It is a simple transaction. Preston, I said, "Your freedom for your reputation." "My reputation is everything," Preston screamed, the veins in his neck bulging. "If I post that, I am dead. No one will ever hire me again. I will be a laughingstock. I can't do it. I won't do it." He looked at Stanford. "Dad, tell her I can't destroy my brand. I can go somewhere else. Start over. But I need my name." I watched him, even now, standing on the precipice of prison. His narcissism was his priority. He honestly believed his brand was worth more than his freedom. "Very well," I said calmly. "Option A." "It is." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my personal cell phone. I did not hesitate. I tapped the screen 3 times. 911. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear. I looked Preston dead in the eye as the line began to ring. "Hello," I said into the phone, my voice dropping into a frantic, distressed register that I had perfected over years of undercover corporate work. "Yes, I need the police immediately. I am at the Vanguard building in Midtown. I have a man here who has committed federal bank fraud and is refusing to leave the premises. He is becoming aggressive." "Valerie, stop!" Beatrice shrieked. I ignored her. "Yes, officer. His name is Preston Norcross. He is suddenly..." A blur of motion erupted from the other side of the table. Stanford lunged. He didn't lunge at me. He lunged at Preston. He grabbed Preston by the lapels of his suit and slammed him back against the wall. Before Preston could react, Stanford raised his hand and struck him across the face. Crack! The sound of the slap was louder than the pitcher hitting the table earlier. It was the sound of a father breaking his own idol. Preston's head snapped to the side, a bright red handprint instantly blooming on his cheek. "Do it!" Stanford roared, shaking his son violently. "Do what she says, Dad." Preston gasped, clutching his cheek, looking at his father with utter betrayal. "Do not look at me," Stanford screamed, spit flying from his mouth. "You have ruined me. You drained my pension. You made me sign away my house. I will not sleep on the street because you want to save your pathetic reputation." Stanford shoved him toward the table. "Pick up the phone, you idiot. Pick it up and post it." I lowered my own phone. I hadn't actually dialed 911. I had dialed my voicemail, but the performance had achieved the desired result. The facade of the United Norcross front had crumbled. When pushed to the brink, Stanford chose self-preservation. He chose the roof over his head, over the son he had spoiled for 35 years. Preston stood trembling by the table. He looked at his mother. Beatrice turned her head away, staring out the window, refusing to make eye contact. She, too, had made her choice. She wanted to stay in the manor. Preston picked up his phone. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped it once before picking it up again. "I sent the text of the confession to your phone," I said coldly. "Copy and paste. Do not edit a single word." I walked around the table and stood behind him, watching over his shoulder. I watched him open the social media apps. I watched him paste the text that detailed his fraud, his failures, and his lies. I watched his thumb hover over the post button. "Do it." Stanford growled from behind us. Preston let out a sob, a broken, strangled sound, and pressed the button. Posted. I watched the progress bar complete. I watched the first likes and confused comments start to appear instantly from his network. "Now the resignation," I said, sliding a piece of paper across the table, "and the renunciation of inheritance." He signed. He didn't even read it. He just scribbled his name, his tears spotting the paper. I picked up the documents. I checked the signatures. I checked the social media posts one last time to ensure they were public. I placed the papers in my briefcase and snapped the lock shut. The sound echoed in the silent room like a final judgment. The transaction was successful, I said. I looked at the 3 of them, the broken son, the furious father, and the coward mother. "You have 1 hour to vacate my conference room," I said. "And Preston." He looked up, his eyes hollow. "If I ever see you in New York again, I will print that PDF and mail it to the FBI myself. Have a safe trip." 2 security guards, men with necks as thick as tree trunks and expressions void of sympathy, materialized at the door. I had signaled them moments ago. a silent command sent from my phone while Preston was busy destroying his own life on social media. They did not ask him to leave. They simply hoisted him up by his armpits, treating him like a sack of unwanted refuse. "Get your hands off me," Preston shrieked, his voice raw and ragged. "I am a partner here. I am a partner." "Not anymore," I said, my voice cutting through his panic. One of the guards handed him his leather bag. It was light, empty of the laptop I had confiscated as evidence and the fraudulent documents he had signed. He was leaving with exactly what he had brought to this family: absolutely nothing. I watched them drag him down the hallway toward the elevators. He was kicking and screaming, a man-child throwing a tantrum in a suit he had bought with stolen money. His phone, which was still in his hand, was lighting up incessantly. The notifications were not job offers or consolations. They were the beginning of the end. The industry is small, and news travels at the speed of light. By the time he hit the pavement of Midtown Manhattan, he would be blacklisted from every financial institution from here to London. He was not just unemployed, he was radioactive. The elevator doors slid shut, cutting off his wails. Silence rushed back into the boardroom, heavy and absolute. I turned back to the table. Stanford and Beatrice were still sitting there, but they were no longer the titans of Connecticut society who had walked in an hour ago. They looked shrunken. My father's posture, usually so rigid and imposing, had collapsed. He sat with his head in his hands, staring at the grain of the walnut table. My mother was clutching her handbag to her chest, her eyes darting around the room like a frightened bird realizing the cage door is locked. They looked old. For the first time, I saw the wrinkles around their eyes and the liver spots on their hands not as signs of distinguished age, but as markers of decay. They were two elderly people with no savings, no retirement, and a son who was a felon. I walked over to my briefcase and pulled out the final document. It was a standard residential lease agreement. I slid it across the table, placing it directly between them. "This is a standard 12-month lease for the property located at 42 Oak Lane," I said. Stanford looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "A lease. For my own house." "It is not your house, Dad," I corrected him gently. "It is my house. You are the occupants." I tapped the paper. "The rent is set at fair market value for a 6-bedroom estate in Fairfield County. That is $8,500 a month." Beatrice gasped. "8,000, Valerie. We live on a fixed income now. The pension is gone. How can we afford that?" "That sounds like a budgeting problem." "Mother," I said, echoing the words she had said to me when I asked for help with my tuition a decade ago, "maybe you should cut back on the spa treatments. Or perhaps Dad can sell his golf clubs. I hear there is a robust second-hand market for vintage drivers." I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a steel whisper. "The rent is due on the 1st of every month. If you are late by a single day, I will begin eviction proceedings. I will put your furniture on the curb, and I will change the locks. Do you understand?" They nodded, terrified. They understood. They were no longer the masters of the universe. They were tenants, living on the sufferance of the daughter they had discarded. "And one more thing," I added, straightening up and smoothing my skirt. "Do not ever call me to pour coffee, wash a car, or serve your guests again. If you invite me to dinner, I will sit at the head of the table. If you cannot accept that, do not invite me." I turned on my heel and walked toward the door. I did not look back. I did not need to see their shame. I had carried their shame for 30 years. It was their turn to carry it now. Elias met me in the hallway. He was holding the termination paperwork, his face a mask of professional curiosity. "Madam Chairwoman," Elias said quietly, "we have a procedural question. Do you want to formally terminate your brother from the partner position? Technically, he never completed the buy-in, so the contract is void, but we could issue a separation notice for the file." I stopped. I thought about the title of the story Preston had tried to write for himself. I thought about his arrogance, his bragging, his belief that he owed the world simply because he existed. I smiled. It was a genuine smile. The first one I had felt in years. Actually, Elias. I said, he was never hired. He was never a partner. He was just a mark. I looked at the paperwork in Elias's hand. But yes, send the termination notice anyway. Make it official. Write it on the thickest, most expensive cardstock we have. And Elias. Madam Chairwoman. Frame it, I said. Frame it in a nice, heavy black frame and mail it to my parents' house. I want them to hang it on the wall right next to his diploma, a reminder of the day the new partner was fired. I walked out of the double glass doors and into the elevator. The ride down to the lobby felt like floating. The crushing weight that had sat on my chest since I was 18 years old, the weight of seeking their approval, of trying to be good enough, of hiding my success to avoid bruising their fragile egos, was gone. I stepped out of the building and into the humid New York afternoon. The air smelled of exhaust and hot asphalt, but to me, it smelled like oxygen, pure, unadulterated oxygen. The valet was waiting at the curb. He was not holding the keys to a Honda Civic. He was holding the keys to my car, the car I had bought 3 months ago and kept in storage, waiting for this specific day. It was a midnight blue Bentley Continental. It gleamed in the sunlight, a shark in a sea of yellow taxis. I took the keys and tipped the valet $100. He looked at me with wide eyes. "Have a nice day." "Miss," he said. "I will," I replied. "I really will." I slid into the driver's seat. The leather was soft, smelling of success and autonomy. I placed my phone on the center console. As I started the engine, the screen lit up with a notification from my bank. Incoming transfer, $8,500. Source Stanford and Beatrice Norcross. Retirement savings. Memo rent. I laughed. It was a quiet sound, but it filled the car. They had paid immediately. They were afraid. Good. Fear is a much more reliable motivator than love, especially in this family. I put the car in gear and pulled out into traffic, merging seamlessly with the flow of the city. I was leaving them behind. I was leaving the drama, the abuse, and the manipulation back in that conference room, trapped in a lease agreement they could barely afford. I was not Valerie the scapegoat anymore. I was not Valerie the receptionist. I was Valerie Norcross, owner of Phoenix Capital, landlord of the Norcross Manor, and the woman who had just bought her freedom. There would be no forgiveness. Forgiveness is for people who made mistakes. My family had not made mistakes. They had made choices. They had chosen to use me, to belittle me, and to sacrifice me for their golden son. So I had made a choice too. I chose the ledger. I chose the balance sheet. I chose the cold, hard justice of the market. I turned up the radio and drove toward the bridge, leaving the wreckage in my rearview mirror. The view had never looked so beautiful. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment down below sharing your location and your thoughts on Valerie's revenge. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the Sunday Drama Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach more people. See you in the next episode.